Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's training session on the inclusion list and selective sync in the HubSpot Salesforce integration. We are going to have a smaller group today coming back from the holiday and kind of easing back in to work life this week. So just to orient everyone, if you haven't been to training before, these sessions are 45 minutes long. I'm going to run through some content that I've put together around what an inclusion list is, what selective sync is, and when we would use one or the other. And then we're going to do Q&A at the end. Whenever you signed up, you asked some questions, so we're going to address those. And then we're also going to have time for free questions at the end. So I want to get started with a quick poll. I know there's only a few of us there, but I'm going to go ahead and just publish these and see if we can get some answers. So go ahead and let me know, does your company have the HubSpot Salesforce integration currently? Just a quick yes or no. Awesome. Okay, so most of us do. Awesome. So just one more poll here. So do you have an inclusion list? So yes, no, not sure, or I'm not using the integration, doesn't apply. Okay, cool. So some of us do, some of us aren't sure. Awesome. So as I go through today, that just helps me know if everyone has one, then we don't have to do background on what it is. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So first, who am I? My name is Lauren Ryan. I am the founder and chief marketing nerd of Coastal Consulting. We are a super small boutique HubSpot and Salesforce partner. It's just me and my sister. Usually she's here with us, but she actually gave birth to my nephew last weekend, so she is out on maternity leave. So congrats to Sarah, and wish you were here. As far as why you should listen to me, I am the go-to expert on the HubSpot Salesforce integration in the market right now. I work exclusively in repairing and installing the HubSpot Salesforce integration. So I work with teams who are overwhelmed with duplicate records, drowning in sync errors, and really needing some direction on how HubSpot and Salesforce work together. I'm a technical expert in both platforms, and right now I'm booked out until January because there are a lot of people like you who are struggling with the integration and really want to get it right for next year. So if that's you, feel free to reach out, but I promise this isn't a sales pitch. So what are we going to cover today? 4 separate sections. 1, how data syncs between HubSpot and Salesforce. This is an important one to know whenever you're trying to figure out how data syncs. So it's kind of foundational to an inclusion list and selective sync. So after that, we're going to do Q&A. There's a question section at the bottom of Livestorm where we host these events. So at the end, I'll go through and do questions there. So feel free to add those as we go throughout. So at the end, we'll go over the questions that you did ask whenever you were registering, and then we'll answer questions that you're asking throughout. Kathy, yes, this is being recorded. And also, I just dropped the link to the slides in the chat. So you can use those to follow along and then save afterwards. There's some links in there that can take you to some additional resources that I'm sharing. Now, let's dive in. I do have the chat open, so if I'm going too fast or if you need me to repeat something, let me know. This is being recorded. It'll be shared with you right after the event, but I know that I do talk really fast sometimes, so just let me know. Okay, getting started. 1, how does data sync in the integration? Since most of us have the integration, you've probably seen this panel before. So this lives in HubSpot. And it shows how the different objects sync between HubSpot and Salesforce. So contacts, companies, deals, activities, and tickets are the standard objects that sync. And you can sync up to 10 custom objects with Salesforce as well. Just a note, custom objects can be created in Salesforce and synced down to HubSpot, but they can't be created in HubSpot and synced up to Salesforce just now with the native integration. But you'll see how data is syncing here, and you can control the individual settings in the integration itself. As a general rule, the integration syncs on a bidirectional, it's bidirectional sync. So HubSpot updates Salesforce, Salesforce updates HubSpot. It syncs on a 15-minute cadence. So every 15 minutes, the systems check for updates from one another, except for a few specific fields which do trigger an immediate sync. And I have a blog linked in the resources slide that indicate which fields are going to update that immediate sync. So if you've ever wondered, I just updated this property, it's not updating the Salesforce field, what's going on there, you can reference that article to see if it is a field that would update it immediately or if it's one that does take a while. 3, the data syncs in the integration for mapped fields only. So sometimes you think whenever you install the integration that all the fields on either side are going to sync regardless. If you're going to create a field in Salesforce, you need to create a matching property in HubSpot and map it. They're not automatically created or updated across the two systems. So it needs to be maintained, new properties added and added as a field mapping, or else it won't map. And also, it will only map with the instructions you've given it. So if you say only use Salesforce, HubSpot won't be able to update that property. If it's two-way sync, either of them is going to take the most recent value, right? So something to keep in mind. Next, it's only mapped objects. So just like it's mapped fields, it's only mapped objects. So if you do not have the company sync turned on, you're not syncing companies. It's pretty simple. As a refresher, contacts sync to leads and contacts in Salesforce, HubSpot companies sync to Salesforce accounts, and HubSpot deals sync to Salesforce opportunities. This is the basic structure of how things sync. Again, HubSpot tickets sync to Salesforce cases. That's a newer one. But this is the basic sync of how most people have it set up. Finally, allowed records and fields only, or what sync between Salesforce and HubSpot. And this is where we're really focusing today. What are those allowed records and what are those allowed fields? First, a quick terminology note. Fields in Salesforce are properties in HubSpot. So if you have the first name field in Salesforce, it's the first name property in HubSpot, just so everyone knows as we go through. Although they are properties in HubSpot, they're called field mappings in the integration. So just making sure we're all on the same page there. Now, let's dive into the bulk of today. Today, we are talking about inclusion lists and selective sync. The first question that I get a lot on this topic is, should I use an inclusion list or selective sync to control my data flow? And this is not the right question. It's really, should I use an inclusion list and selective sync, or just an inclusion list, or nothing? So inclusion lists and selective sync are actually completely different entities and do totally different things. They're just the two data flow tools when it comes to the integration outside of the standard sync settings that you can set in the integration panel. So it's not should I use one or the other, it's which one should I use and should I use both. As a spoiler alert, the usual answer is most people should use an inclusion list and most people shouldn't use selective sync. And if you're using selective sync, you should definitely have an inclusion list. So let's break that down a little bit. Okay, so what is an inclusion list? An inclusion list syncs from HubSpot to Salesforce. It's controlling the data flow from HubSpot to Salesforce. So if you think of like a dam, which isn't a great example because a river only flows one way, but if you think of there being like a dam between HubSpot and Salesforce, an inclusion list is the one that's controlling the flow of water from HubSpot to Salesforce, and selective sync is controlling from Salesforce to HubSpot. So if you're thinking about, I need to solve a data challenge, I need to control what data HubSpot can see in Salesforce, you're looking at selective sync. If you want to control when stuff flows from HubSpot to Salesforce, you're looking at an inclusion list. So just getting this visual in your mind of what problem you're trying to solve. Okay, so first, what is an inclusion list? What it is. An inclusion list is an active list in HubSpot that's set in the integration settings. In a little bit, I'll show you how to see if you have one and where to find it in HubSpot. So just know that an inclusion list is an active list in HubSpot, and you indicate which list you're using in the integration settings for the HubSpot Salesforce integration in HubSpot. Now, what does an inclusion list do? It does two things. Most people know about the first one, but most people don't know about the second one, and that's the one that's most commonly missed. So 1, an inclusion list controls when contact records in HubSpot are created in Salesforce. So as you probably know, the HubSpot integration can create new leads or new contacts in Salesforce. You set that in the integration settings. It can't create both. It's one or the other. But regardless, the inclusion list will control when a new record is created in Salesforce for a contact or a lead object. 2, it controls which records in HubSpot stay in sync with Salesforce. This is the one that's most commonly missed. So we know that if they're on the inclusion list, they're going to get created in Salesforce. But if they're not on the inclusion list, they're not going to stay in sync. So whenever you're building your inclusion list, you want to make sure you're accounting for the records that are already in HubSpot or Salesforce that you want to stay in sync, not just have newly created. If you're wondering if you have an inclusion list or where you can see the inclusion list, Julia, I think this is your question. Let me know if it's not. You can go to the integration settings under HubSpot. You can go into the connected apps, the Salesforce integration. And then if you click contacts, you can scroll down on that page to see the limiting what syncs section. In this section, you'll see the inclusion list right here. If you see view list with a little pop-out box for it to open the list in a new window, then you have an inclusion list. If it says select your list, I believe it says right there, or you don't have this view list pop out, you're not using an inclusion list currently, which can be fine. Not everyone needs to use one. But in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the ideal way to set up an inclusion list, according to me, and how to test your inclusion list for records. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and go to the integration, open up your view list, and then you can follow along with your inclusion list there. Okay, so I get this question a lot, and as everyone in this field knows, so often the answer is, well, it depends. So what's the ideal inclusion list? And well, it depends. It's going to change a little bit from organization to organization, but as someone who's done, I don't even know how many integrations between HubSpot and Salesforce, and I'm in this every day, this is my recommendation as the general best practice across as many accounts as I've worked in. This is my standard go-to start, and then we tweak from here. So because we want to control when records are created in Salesforce, and we want to keep records in sync between HubSpot and Salesforce, I typically create an inclusion list that says they are the lifecycle stage of this record is a marketing qualified lead or beyond, or they already exist in Salesforce. So this criteria includes lifecycle stage is MQL, SQL, opportunity, or customer, and evangelist if you use that one, or last Salesforce sync time is known because this is a property on that HubSpot contact record that updates the last time it's synced with Salesforce, or Salesforce contact ID or lead ID is known. Fun fact, this field does not auto map when you install the integration, and most people actually don't have the ID property mapped. So you want to make sure you go to contacts in your integration settings and map the Salesforce contact ID with the property ID on the contact and lead object in Salesforce, just to make sure you have data there. Or the original source includes Salesforce. So using this combination of filters, we're accounting for if they're a marketing qualified lead or beyond, and we're keeping everything that came from Salesforce in the first place in sync. Because even if we wouldn't count the sales leads as marketing qualified leads as of right now, if they're already in Salesforce, we want them to stay in sync, right? So this is my ideal inclusion list. When this would change, we'll get into that in a little bit, but usually it just depends on what you want in Salesforce. So if you want everything in Salesforce, you probably don't need an inclusion list. If you only want sales qualified leads, like let's say your BDRs are in HubSpot too, then you would change the criteria to only when they're SQLs. We'll get into a little bit more on this in a bit, but just keep in mind, this is my ideal starter inclusion list. So now that we know that, how do we troubleshoot an inclusion list? The biggest challenge that people run into with inclusion lists is whenever, sorry, I'm actually keeping track of the comments right now. Annie, I agree. It's wild that it's not included. So how do we troubleshoot an inclusion list? HubSpot released this feature within the last year, and it was just such a game changer for people managing the HubSpot Salesforce integration. So you can now test lists in HubSpot, and I do this all the time. So if a client reaches out and they say, hey, why is this contact not in the inclusion list, or why are they not syncing with Salesforce? The first thing I do is open their inclusion list and I go to test a contact. So in this one, this is in my demo account. So I tested Dana Smith to see if they were on the inclusion list, and they are. So whenever you go to test a contact, you can just open your list, any active list, honestly. But if you have your inclusion list open, you can type in a contact, any contact, and select them, and it'll show either green or red right here. It will show if they are included on the inclusion list. And then a step further, it'll show you why they are or are not. So Dana Smith is on the inclusion list because they met all of the criteria that I had laid out just in the last slide. But if they were not green, like if they were red, it would highlight the box that disqualified them as red as well. So for this one, they met the criteria, everything's green, all of it was an OR criteria, but sometimes inclusion lists get a little bit more complex. And so it's helpful to see, even within the criteria itself, the little X's versus the checkbox of, yes, they met this criteria, no, they didn't. This is so helpful for troubleshooting the inclusion list, whereas you used to have to look and like use your brain and figure out why it wasn't there. No one wants to do that. This is way easier. So this is how you test a contact in your inclusion list to see why it's not syncing with Salesforce. Now, packaging that up, just like a quick recap, an inclusion list is an active list in HubSpot. It's chosen in your integration settings to see if it's in to choose if you're using one or not. You just select it from a drop-down list in your HubSpot Salesforce integration settings. If someone is not on the list, they're not being created in Salesforce by HubSpot, and they're not actively in sync. So if they're not on the list and something gets updated in HubSpot, that's not going to Salesforce. Now, let's transition into selective sync. So like we talked about, an inclusion list controls HubSpot to Salesforce. Selective sync controls Salesforce to HubSpot. So what is selective sync? Disclaimer, if you are not a Salesforce admin, some of this terminology is going to be kind of like, what is she saying? So you would tag in your Salesforce admin for selective sync. The HubSpot admin can control inclusion lists. A lot of people are both in the Salesforce admin. That's what I do, is I'm both. But if you are a HubSpot admin and you need some help on the Salesforce side, you want to be aligned with your Salesforce admin of what's in the selective sync and what's in the inclusion list. But just understand the expectation is not always that the HubSpot admin would handle this piece, but it's good for you to understand it so you can better communicate with your Salesforce admin, especially if it's an outsourced team that's managing it. So one, what is it? Selective sync is a really fun name. It's kind of complicated, fancy, for custom configuration of the user profile, permission sets, and or organizational sharing rules in Salesforce, which is controlled by a user's role. So just a quick educational moment. So a user in Salesforce has a profile and permission sets which control what they can do. So if I'm a system administrator profile with no role in Salesforce, I can do anything. But if I'm a sales manager profile with like Northeastern district role, then I can only see certain records that my Salesforce admin has configured. So your profile controls what you can do, and your role and your organizational sharing rules can control what you can see. So why does this matter? While a lot of integrations are connected with an API configuration, which is more like coding and stuff like that, the HubSpot Salesforce integration is connected by an actual Salesforce user. So the person who's connecting your integration has to be a full Salesforce user, which frustrates some people for having to pay for a Salesforce license, but it's best if they are a dedicated integration user. And if you're using Selective Sync, they really have to be a dedicated integration user. So this Salesforce user profile and user license is just for the HubSpot integration. And so for this individual user, you're going to do a custom profile, you're going to do some permission sets, and you're going to update your organizational sharing rules based off of the specific role you create for the HubSpot integration to control what they can do and what they can see in Salesforce. Okay, so that's what it is. This is what it does. Two things again. Selective Sync controls what the HubSpot integration user can see in Salesforce, and it controls what the HubSpot integration user can do in Salesforce. So because this is a Salesforce user, HubSpot is essentially a Salesforce user. Whenever you're setting up the integration, you want to treat everything in HubSpot as if HubSpot is a person. Like, we want HubSpot to be able to see this. We want HubSpot to be able to do this. And so when you're configuring the integration, you want to have that conversation internally of what is it in Salesforce that we just can't touch? Like, what is so important that HubSpot can't see it? And on that note, who should use Selective Sync? Anyone who needs to hide data from HubSpot, and not just wants to, but needs to. So Selective Sync can cause some challenges, which we'll talk about in a bit. So it's not something that you want to use in every account because it's not usually necessary. and it can cause problems. So we don't want to put friction where friction's not needed, right? So it's not just if you want to hide data because you're a Salesforce admin that like wants to keep things in Salesforce. It's if you need to. So who needs to? Let's say that we wanted to hide like the employee count on the account object or the opportunity amount on the deal object. We're not going to implement selective sync for that. We're just going to make it where HubSpot can't update those properties because those aren't important as far as hiding from HubSpot. We might want to make sure HubSpot can't update them, and we can do that using field mappings in the integration, or we can just not map those properties. Super easy. What we want to do is to make sure that HubSpot can't in any way access properties if we're using selective sync. For example, social security number or patient information if you have HIPAA protected data. So a lot of people are in the healthcare space. They're like, hey, I want good marketing too. I'd like to use HubSpot. It is possible to use HubSpot if you have HIPAA protected data. If you are using Salesforce as your primary CRM and blocking the HIPAA protected data from going into HubSpot. I work with a lot of clients on doing that. So I'm happy to like book a consultation. We can talk about it if that's your use case, because it gets pretty complicated, but it's totally doable and within the bounds of HIPAA. So just know if that's your reason for not using HubSpot, 98% of the time, there's a way to work around it. So these are the people who really need selective sync. Other instances of using selective sync that would make sense, that the biggest one people use is if they're using HubSpot for a specific business unit, but no other business unit at the organization. Like if we're acquiring companies and we're using HubSpot for one company we acquired, but nothing else, then we would use selective sync to just control Salesforce records for that business unit going to HubSpot. Because usually there's other marketing automation platforms for different business units that have their own marketing automation integration user. That's a super complicated use case and doesn't apply to most people. Gonna address Alex's question. Why not just avoid mapping the social security number rather than using selective sync? I don't know what your role is, but most people who are HIPAA admins would like never allow that. The reason being is it can be done. So you can just not map it, and that's totally fine. But then you have to trust anyone who is a HubSpot admin or an external user to never map it. So the integration has access to see that social security number and add a field mapping at any time. So it still gives HubSpot that access to pull in the data if they wanted to. And most admins don't want to do that. So they would just say, nope, HubSpot can't even see that social security number exists. It only lives in Salesforce. But if you can go in and see it in HubSpot, you could pull in that data at any time. So you can do that as long as you have like trust and support of your agencies to make sure it'll never be pulled through, but most admins just wouldn't allow it. Oliver said we did selective sync, so HubSpot could not update Salesforce opportunities. Yes, this would affect attribution reporting in HubSpot. You don't need to do selective sync for this. You can just not map the opportunity object in the integration. You can just choose not to map deals and opportunities. But to get the revenue attribution reporting in HubSpot, you have to have the UTM parameters put on the deal in HubSpot, or else it'll just show original source as the source if it's coming from Salesforce. Alex, the Salesforce admin configuring the HubSpot user is using selective sync. So that's what selective sync is. It's just configuring the integration user. So that's what this is. It's a fancy name for configuring the integration user. Okay, moving on. Q&A. Cool. We're kind of doing that right now. So time to ask your questions. We're in the chat talking through these questions, but feel free to go to the questions side. While y'all are putting those in there, I'm going to go through the questions that were submitted when everyone signed up. So what are the best practices for sending info from HubSpot to Salesforce? This depends who is in what system. And Samantha, you asked, does it work better for BDRs to work in HubSpot or Salesforce? The answer to this has recently changed, like recently within the past 2 years. So hear me out on this one. Keep an open mind on this answer. So one, the best practices, I think is a very loose term because best practice depends so much on the situation. But 2 answers here. First, determine ownership for HubSpot and Salesforce. Who lives in which system? This is going to determine entirely how we should send info from HubSpot to Salesforce, right? And then 2, we're going to send data from HubSpot to Salesforce when it's ready for the team in Salesforce. So if we just have marketing in HubSpot, which is the more traditional setup, I would say send data to Salesforce when it hits the lifecycle stage as MQL, when it becomes marketing qualified. Then it'll go to BDRs and it'll go to sales in Salesforce. But if your BDR team is in HubSpot, I would say whenever it hits SQL or opportunity based off of your organization's needs, then send it to Salesforce. So essentially, we don't want to send data to Salesforce prematurely. There's a few reasons for this, but like culturally, the best one I've found is sales has this like mindset, and it's more legacy. It's not as current, of just the data coming from marketing isn't as good, or like those leads aren't as qualified or whatever. So if you are sending over every lead marketing gets, like people who just download a survey from a competitor, like obviously sales isn't going to trust your data that much. So it's really putting in that quality check of, we only send over quality data to sales. We only send it over when it's sales ready. So best practice is going to be determined by who's in which system. And I would send data from HubSpot to Salesforce when it's ready for whoever's waiting for it in Salesforce. How can I control data in the sync? 5 answers here. 1, use an inclusion list to limit when data is sent from HubSpot to Salesforce. 2, use field mapping criteria to limit when HubSpot can update data in Salesforce. You can lock down any field in the integration to not be updated by HubSpot at all. 3, use Selective Sync to hide protected or irrelevant data from HubSpot. Again, I would use this sparingly, but it's totally available. And again, Selective Sync is just a fancy name for user profile permissions, permission sets, and sharing roles in Salesforce. 4, use a third-party tool like InCycle to monitor for duplicates and data quality. And 5, use a data lake or MuleSoft, something like that, instead of the native integration. I don't cover this. This isn't what my company does, but if you wanted to use like Aptitude 8 or a firm that's more like technical when it comes to API integrations, all of that, you can of course build a custom integration. It's just not something I support. Best way to build an inclusion list. We went over this, but I'm going to expand on it a little bit. So we talked about having one active list in HubSpot as your inclusion list. You can only choose one list in the integration, but someone asked, what if I have a series of other lists and then the inclusion list is just saying they're a member of one of these lists? So I like to keep things as simple as possible for several reasons. 1, it's really easy to troubleshoot if things are simple. And 2, it gives a lot of clarity throughout the organization if we have a very simple structure to how we're syncing data. So I like to have one active list in HubSpot and one workflow that sets each lifecycle stage in HubSpot. So the inclusion list says they're a marketing qualified lead, sales qualified lead, etc., using the HubSpot lifecycle stage property. But what's setting that? So natively, opportunity and customer are set by a deal being created and associated with the record, or a deal being won. But marketing qualified lead and sales qualified lead are not automatically set by HubSpot. And if you're not setting those fields strategically, I would do it today. Like start today. Figure out what an MQL and SQL is and start automating it so you can get that funnel reporting in HubSpot, because it's awesome. But I only have one workflow that updates each lifecycle stage. If you go into an account and see that the lifecycle stage is used in like 50 workflows, and you're trying to see which workflow set it as an MQL, you can see that in the property history in HubSpot, but it would be much simpler if you could just see the enrollment history of one workflow and control the marketing qualified lead status in that one workflow. Same for SQL and everything else. So I like to have that single point of once they go through this workflow, they're an MQL and they go on the inclusion list. Again, happy to work with anybody on that. What are the pitfalls of Selective Sync? This is an obvious question based off of what we've talked through today. So 1, hidden records from HubSpot creating duplicates in Salesforce. This is a huge implication of Selective Sync if it's done in certain ways. So let's say we wanted to hide the contact object from HubSpot. This is something I've seen people do. This is like the force rig of only letting HubSpot sync leads to Salesforce. Because as you know, probably that HubSpot can only create one record in Salesforce. So if there's an existing contact, it's not going to create a new lead. So one way around that is just hiding the contact object from HubSpot so it creates a lead every time it syncs. The challenge with that is, let's say you do have a contact in Salesforce and HubSpot can't see it, then it's just going to keep creating a lead every time it tries to sync that record to Salesforce. And then you have tons of leads that you don't need, that you need to then like convert and move down the Salesforce process. So There's a lot of different scenarios similar to that one, where if you're hiding records from HubSpot through the profile configuration in Salesforce, that can create an issue, right? 2, marketing needs data that was hidden unnecessarily. If we're over restricting Salesforce from working with HubSpot, which is really common with like highly restrictive orgs, marketing might need data that they can't get because of how the user profile was configured. And then you need a system admin to go in and adjust that profile to give data, which is nice. That's why it's nice to just leave the data open. That doesn't have to be secured down, so HubSpot can then access it. Because marketing may not need to update data, but it might need certain fields to filter campaigns and stuff like that. So if there's not a reason that marketing cannot see that data, then it's probably best to just leave it open and available. Finally, 3, sync errors from lack of visibility and permissions. This is a big one. It can be worked around, but just understand that if you're doing selective sync as an admin, like you need to give marketing some time out of your sprint or out of your schedule to address sync errors and be there to support them. It's really challenging in organizations when you're a system admin and you lock down Salesforce from HubSpot. It does not create marketing alignment with the rest of the organization, and you can really handcuff your marketing team as to what they're able to achieve. So this is my plea to Salesforce admins out there. It is okay to put restrictions on HubSpot. It's okay to put permissions, but please continue to be an available resource for your marketing team if they need help from you or they need some access, so you can give it to them and not restrict your team too far. Next, where should lead assignment happen in the integration? This one's not super relevant to this conversation, but it was thrown in. The answer is the same as when should data sync from Salesforce to HubSpot to Salesforce. It depends on who lives in which system. If you're I love using HubSpot for round robin lead assignment. Like, it's so easy in HubSpot. You can set it up in 2 minutes without needing like a third-party app or the coding that you do in Salesforce. If your BDRs live in HubSpot, I do assignment in HubSpot. If they live in Salesforce, I would do assignment there. Super simple. How do I redo my inclusion list? So let's say you've gone through this and you're like, wow, my inclusion list is terrible. I really need to clean it up. This is a text heavy slide. Again, you can download the slides. I put it in the link and I can email it out too if anybody would like it. So first you would create an active list in HubSpot for the new inclusion list. Figure out what your requirements are. Go ahead and create that new list. Then you're going to create 2 more active lists, 1 for contacts in your new list and not in your current list, and 3 for contacts not in your new list that are in your old list. And so then you can see, okay, who's going to be added to the integration, who's going to be removed. Confirm you're good with that. If you're not, make some tweaks to the new inclusion list, and then change your list. And what I'm going to say here is if you want records to only exist in HubSpot, like usually when you change that list, you're like, oh, more things have synced to Salesforce than we want. Let's pull it back. You can just go and delete those records in Salesforce. You just want to make sure that the setting is set in the contacts mapping in the integration to not delete records in HubSpot just because they were deleted in Salesforce. So if you change your inclusion list and want to pull things back out of Salesforce, totally fine. Okay, run through the chat really quickly. Christina asks, what about preventing groups of contacts leads coming into HubSpot? And we don't want in HubSpot at all. So if you wanted to prevent records from coming from Salesforce to HubSpot, it would be through the inclusion list. Through Selective Sync. Okay, so if we're preventing from Salesforce to HubSpot, we're going to use Selective Sync. You were saying billing, accounts, contacts, etc. You would have to be super specific about what you wouldn't want to sync, because the challenge is here is, let's say that you didn't want accounts to be visible if they were set as a billing account or something was changed. Like some sort of flag on this account is going to control if it's visible. Well, if that flag has not been set yet and it is created in HubSpot, we now have like an orphan record in HubSpot that now it can't see in Salesforce, but it could before. So that's either going to be a sync error or it's going to try to create it again because it couldn't see it to begin with. So it's totally fine. But if you're preventing from Salesforce to HubSpot, it has to be Selective Sync, which again is just a term that they use in the integration documentation for custom profile permission sets, roles, and sharing roles. Should BDRs be in HubSpot or Salesforce? BDRs are typically in Salesforce, but more so in Outreach or SalesLoft or some sort of third-party sales tool. Most of them don't work just in Salesforce. So the question is more so, are they in Salesforce and Outreach, or are they in Salesforce and HubSpot? And more recently, especially if you're already using the HubSpot integration for marketing, I would encourage your sales leader to at least do a demo with the HubSpot team, or me. I can do it too. It's a little bit less intimidating and like pressuring because I won't try to sell you on it, of Sales Hub with Marketing Hub and Salesforce. Sales Hub has automated email sequences, meeting tools, and a benefit of having your sales team in HubSpot or your BDRs is they can see the data that HubSpot's collecting, like page views on your website or when people viewed an email that doesn't sync through Salesforce through to Outreach, because you should never connect HubSpot to Outreach and Outreach to Salesforce. And Outreach could also be SalesLoft or whatever sales engagement tool you're using. But for a very aligned and connected org, I really like to have data in HubSpot and BDRs in HubSpot. And then once records are ready for sales, it can sync through to Salesforce. So it's kind of like your BDRs are added to your top of funnel team that are working records for the sales team. Sales Hub has been a really great resource for that. It's really grown in market share recently over Outreach or SalesLoft. Happy to talk to anybody about that. It's not linked in these slides, but we do have a blog article on that on our website. Let's see. Something else about that, actually, I'll add is if you have your BDRs in Outreach and your marketing team in HubSpot and you're not sending data to Salesforce until they're MQLs, then your BDRs are not finding out about your marketing qualified leads until they are marketing qualified leads. So all the other leads that you're working more top of funnel are not visible to your sales team in Outreach because they're not visible to Salesforce, which then syncs them to Outreach. So if I've lost anyone, sorry, but it's easier to have your BDRs and marketing team in the same place. So you don't have to fully open up the integration to get your BDRs all the data they need in Outreach from HubSpot. Again, happy to dive into that deeper with anybody. Let's see. For BDRs to work out of HubSpot instead of, so you need to buy Sales Hub. Yes, you would need Sales Hub Professional. Yeah, exactly. What you said, Stephen, of like worrying about them hitting the same prospect in different systems without realizing that they're in different systems. That's kind of what I just outlined. If that happens a lot, if you're keeping just your leads in HubSpot until they're ready to be synced to Salesforce, then BDRs are in those two separate systems. Marketing and BDRs are working the same leads, but they don't know it. And so that can create a poor customer experience. And yes, you do need Sales Hub seats to have BDRs in HubSpot. That is correct. I'm going to check the questions tab. Nope, nothing over there. Okay, so this was our fourth session out of the 4 training sessions we've done so far. If you want to go back and watch the sync errors, duplicates, sessions, you can do that. This is our 3rd session of 4. Our next session is scheduled for January 16th. Next month, I am moving. It's the holidays, and also I'm going to Italy for a week. So we are not doing a training session next month. So we'll see you in January to talk about leveraging campaigns in HubSpot and Salesforce. I'm super excited about this one. People always wonder, how do I use Salesforce campaigns with HubSpot? Can I integrate them? What's the best way to do that? So we are covering that January 16th at 10 a.m. and registration is open now. This is the resources slide that I mentioned as far as some blogs to help you get some more background. Also, I did not go through the technical step-by-step point and click of how to do selective sync or an inclusion list. That wasn't intentional. It's already exists. So module 3 of our free integration course, lessons 5 and 6, show you point and click how to do selective sync and an inclusion list. So if you're not in that course, go sign up. It's going to be paid in 2024. We're re-releasing it with new data and updating the screen recordings with the new HubSpot UI. But as of today, it's still free. So go sign up and get those lessons before we convert it to a paid offering. And if your Salesforce admin is not here, you are not them. Give them access to the course. It can really help alignment between the HubSpot admin and Salesforce admin to understand the other side of the coin. And finally, I'm going to be sending out a survey for today. They're super important. I read everyone, and I love them. Like, it's so helpful for me. We've only done 3 of these. This is our 3rd. So super exciting. The feedback is so helpful for me. Samantha asked a question. Let me throw it in real quick. Would you sync leads to Salesforce to prevent that overlap? Oh, yes. So if you're using two separate systems, so marketing's and HubSpot BDRs are in Outreach, just circling back super quick, I would sync all of the records from both systems to Salesforce. So your BDRs are not working leads that like marketing may not see. So we want to make sure that both of those teams have visibility into that top of funnel. Anyway, circling back, sending out a survey. I'm asking for feedback, but there's one thing I'm asking for that's new, that's super important to you guys. I only have campaigns on our training roster for next year. So when I started trying out doing these free trainings, I only had the 4 topics that I crowdsourced from LinkedIn, but I would love to do one a month next year to just keep this free offering going and helping people learn about the HubSpot Salesforce integration. So I love doing this. Like, teaching is my main goal. Like, obviously I offer consulting services for HubSpot and Salesforce, and that pays the bills, but I love doing these teaching sessions. So next year, I need 11 new topics for what we're going to talk about, because I've got January covered and I need February through December. So go ahead and submit those ideas in that survey so I can start collecting those and building out like next year's curriculum. And also, I'm finalizing the scripts for our new course release right now. So if there's anything that you've seen in our course that you want more data on or like more information on in the new release, email me about that, LinkedIn, DM me. I would love to hear it, just so I can make sure that's incorporated. And finally, if you do need help with the HubSpot Salesforce integration, you know where to find me. Thank you all for coming. Follow me on LinkedIn, take our survey, and I hope to see you next time. So thanks, y'all. Have a great one.